Chapter 19. I found myself in France a little more than 6 weeks after I enlisted. I had no aptitude with a rifle. I could not even bayonet an effigy of Kaiser Bill convincingly. But I was considered sharp, and they also discovered that I could run quite fast. So I was selected as company runner, which meant that I was also a kind of servant. I forget the word. Batman? That is it. My training company commander was a regular army officer of 30 or so. His name was Captain Montague. He had broken his leg some time before, and so had been unfit for active service till then. A kind of phosphorescent pale elegance about his face, a delicate, gallant mustache. He was one of the most supremely stupid men I have ever met. He taught me a great deal. Before our training was finished, he received an urgent posting in France. That same day he told me, as if he were giving me a magnificent present, that he thought he could pull strings and have me posted with him. Only a man as blank as he would have failed to see the hollowness of my enthusiasm. But unfortunately, he had grown fond of me. He had a brain capable of only one idea at a time. With him, it was the offensive à outrance, the headlong attack, Fauche's great contribution to the human race. The force of the shock is the mass, he used to say. The force of the mass is the impulsion, and the force of the impulsion is the morale. High morale, high impulsion, high shock, victory. Thump on the table. Victory. He made us all learn it by heart, at bayonet drill. Victory, poor fool. I spent the last 2 days with my parents and Lily. She and I swore undying love. The idea of heroic sacrifice had contaminated her, as it had contaminated my father. My mother said nothing, except an old Greek proverb, "A dead man cannot be brave." I remembered that later. We went straight to the front. One of the company commanders there had died of pneumonia, and it was his place Montague had to take. This is early in 1915. It sleeted and rained incessantly. We spent long hours in stationary trains and railway sidings, in gray towns under grayer skies. One knew the troops who had been in action, the ones who sang their way to death. The new recruits were the dupes of the romance of war, but the others were dupes of the reality of war, of the ultimate Totentanz. Like those sad old men and women who haunt every casino, they knew the wheel must always win in the end, but they could not force themselves to leave. We spent a few days on maneuvers, and then one day Montague addressed the company. We were going into battle, a new sort of battle, one in which victory was certain, one that was going to bring us to Berlin in a month. The night of the next day we entrained. The train stopped somewhere in the middle of a flat plain, and we marched eastwards. Dikes and willows in the darkness, endless drizzle. It crept down the columns that the place we were to attack was a village called Neuve-Chapelle, and that the Germans were to receive something revolutionary, a giant gun, a mass attack by the new airplanes. After a while we turned into a field, thick with mud, and were marched up to some farm buildings. 2 hours rest before taking up position for the attack. No one can have slept. It was very cold, and fires were forbidden. My real self began to appear. I began to be afraid, but I told myself that if I was ever to be truly frightened, I should have known it before then. This is what I had willed to execute. This is how war corrupts us. It plays on our pride and our own free will. Before dawn we filed slowly forward, many stops, to the assault positions. I overheard Montague talking with a staff officer. The entire First Army, Haig's, was engaged, with the Second in support, and there seemed to me a safety, a kind of warmth in such numbers. But then we entered the trenches, the terrible trenches with their stench of the urinal, and then the first shells fell near us. I was so innocent that in spite of our so-called training, of all the propaganda, I had never really been able to believe that someone might want to kill me. We were told to halt and stand against the walls. The shells hissed, whined, crashed, then silence, then a splatter of falling clods, and shivering, I awoke from my long sleep. I think the first thing I saw was the isolation of each. It is not the state of war that isolates. It is well known. It brings people together. But the battlefield, that is something different, because that is when the real enemy, death, appears. I no longer saw any warmth in numbers. I saw only Thanatos in them, my death, just as much in my own comrades, in Montague, as in the invisible Germans. The madness of it, Nicholas. Standing in holes in the ground, thousands of men, English, Scots, Indians, French, Germans, one March morning. And what for? If there is a hell, then it is that. Not flames, not pitchforks, but a place without the possibility of reason. Like Neuve-Chapelle that day, a reluctant light began to spread over the eastern sky. The drizzle stopped. A trill of song from somewhere outside the trench. I recognized a hedge sparrow, the last voice from the other world. We moved forward again some way and into the assault trenches. The rifle brigade was to form the second wave of the attack. The German trenches were less than 200 yards ahead, with our front trench only 100 yards from theirs. Montague looked at his watch. He raised his hand. There was complete silence. His hand fell. For some 10 seconds, nothing happened. Then, far behind us, there was a gigantic drum roll, 1,000 timpani, a pause, and then the whole world ahead exploded. Everyone ducked. A shaking of earth, sky, mind, all. You cannot imagine what the first minutes of that bombardment were like. It was the first massive artillery barrage of the war, the heaviest ever delivered. A runner came from the front trenches, down the communicating trench. His face and uniform were streaked with red. Montague asked if he was hit. He said everyone in the front trenches was splashed with blood from the German trenches. They were so close. If only they could have stopped to think, how close. After half an hour, the barrage was moving over the village. Montague at the periscope cried, "They're up!" And then, "The Boches are done for." He leapt onto the parapet and waved to all of us around him to look over the edge of the trench. 100 yards ahead, a long line of men trotted slowly across the scarred earth toward some shattered trees and broken walls. A few isolated shots. A man fell, then stood up and ran on. He had simply tripped. The men about me began to shout as the line reached the first houses, and a cheer came back. A red light soared up, and then we in our turn advanced. It was difficult to walk, and as we went forward, fear was driven out by horror. Not a shot was fired at us, but the ground became increasingly hideous. Nameless things, pink, white, red, mud-bespattered, still with rags of gray or khaki. We crossed our own front trench and traversed the no-man's land. When we came to the German trenches, there was nothing to see. Everything had been either buried or blown out of them. There we halted for a moment, lying down in the craters almost in peace. To the north, the firing was very intense. The Cameronians had been caught on the wire. In 20 minutes, they lost every officer except one, and 4/5 of their men were killed. Figures appeared between the wrecked cottages ahead, their hands high, some of them being held up by friends. They were the first prisoners. Many of them were yellow with lyddite, yellow men out of the white curtain of light. One walked straight toward me, lurching, with his head tilted as if in a dream, and fell straight into a deep crater. A moment later he reappeared, crawling up over the edge, then slowly standing. Lurching forward again, other prisoners came weeping. One vomited blood in front of us and collapsed. Then we were running toward the village. We came into what must have once been a street. Desolation, rubble, fragments of plastered wall, broken rafters, the yellow splashes of lyddite everywhere, the drizzle that had started again gleaming on the stones, on the skin of corpses. Many Germans had been caught in the houses. In 10 minutes I saw a summary of the whole butcher's shop of war. The blood, the gaping holes, the bones sticking out of flesh, the stench of burnt intestines. I am telling you this only because the effect on me. A boy who had never seen even a peacefully dead body before that day was one I should never have predicted. It was not nausea and terror. I saw several men being sick, but I was not. It was an intense new conviction. Nothing could justify this. It was 1,000 times better than England should be a Prussian colony. One reads that such scenes give the green soldiers nothing but a mad lust to kill in his turn. But I had exactly the contrary feeling. I had a mad lust not to be killed. He stood up. I have a test for you. A test? He went into his bedroom, returned almost at once with the oil lamp that had been on the table when we had dinner. In the white pool of light he put what he had brought. I saw a dice, a shaker, a saucer, and a pillbox. I looked up at him on the other side of the table, at his severe eyes on mine. I'm going to explain to you why we went to war, why mankind always goes to war. It is not social or political. It is not countries that go to war, but men. It is like salt. Once one has been to war, one has salt for the rest of one's life. Do you understand? Of course. So in my perfect republic, it would be simple. There would be a test for all young people at the age of 21. They would go to a hospital where they would throw a dice. One of the 6 numbers would mean death. If they threw that, they would be painlessly killed. No mess, no bestial cruelty, no destruction of innocent onlookers, but one clinical throw of the dice. Certainly an improvement on war. You think so? Obviously. You are sure? If it was possible. You said you never saw action in the last war? No. He took the pillbox and shook out, of all things, 6 large molars, yellowish, 2 or 3 with old stoppings. They were issued to spies on both sides during the last war, for use if they were interrogated. He placed one of the teeth on the saucer, then with a small downward jab of the shaker, crushed it. It was brittle, like a liqueur chocolate, but the odor of the colorless liquid was of bitter almonds, acrid and terrifying. He hastily removed the saucer at arm's length to the far corner of the terrace, then returned. Suicide pills? Precisely. Hydrocyanic acid. He picked up the dice and showed me 6 sides. I smiled. You want me to throw? I offer you an entire war in 1 second. Supposing I don't want it. Think. In a minute from now you could be saying, I risked death. I threw for life, and I won life. It is a very wonderful feeling to have survived. Wouldn't a corpse be rather embarrassing for you? I was still smiling, but it was wearing thin. Not at all. I could easily prove it was suicide. He stared at me, and his eyes went through me like a trident through a fish. With 99 persons out of 100, I would have known it was a bluff. But he was different, and a nervousness had hold of me before I could resist it. Russian roulette? Less fallible. These pills work within a few seconds. I don't want to play. Then you were a coward, my friend. He leaned back and watched me. I thought you believed brave men were fools, because they persist in rolling the dice again and again. But a young man who will not risk his life even once is both a fool and a coward. Did you try this on my predecessors? John Leverrier was neither a fool nor a coward. Even Mitford was not the second. And he had me. It was absurd. But I would not let my bluff be called. I reached for the shaker. Wait. He leaned forward and put his hand on my wrist, then placed a tooth by my side. I am not playing at make-believe. You must swear to me that if the number is 6, you will take the pill. His face was totally serious. I felt myself wanting to swallow. I swear, by all that is most sacred to you. I hesitated, shrugged, then said, by all that is most sacred to me. He held out the dice, and I put it in the shaker. I shook it loosely and quickly and threw the dice. It ran over the cloth, hit the brass base of the lamp, rebounded, wavered, fell. It was a 6. Conchis was absolutely motionless, watching me. I knew at once that I was never going to pick up the pill. I could not look at him. Perhaps 15 seconds passed. Then I smiled, looked at him, and shook my head. He reached out again, his eyes still on me, took the tooth beside me, put it in his mouth, and bit it, and swallowed the liquid. I was red. Still watching me, he reached out and put the dice in the shaker, and threw it. It was a 6. Then again, and again it was a 6. He spat out the empty shell of the tooth. What you have just decided is precisely what I decided that morning 40 years ago at Neuve-Chapelle. You have behaved exactly as any intelligent human being should behave. I congratulate you. But what you said, the perfect republic, all perfect republics are perfect nonsense. The craving to risk death is our last great perversion. We come from night, we go into night. Why live in night? But the dice was loaded. Patriotism, propaganda, professional honor, esprit de corps, what are all those things? Cogged dice. There is just one small difference, Nicholas. On the other table, these are real. He put the remaining teeth back in the box, not just ratafia in colored plastic. And the other two, how did they react? He smiled. Another means society employs to control hazard, to prevent a freedom of choice in its slaves, is to tell them that the past was nobler than the present. John Leverrier was a Catholic, and wiser than you. He refused even to be tempted. And Mitford? I do not waste time teaching the blind. His eyes lingered a dry moment on mine, as if to make sure I took the implicit compliment, and then, as if to limit it, he turned out the lamp. I was left in more than the literal darkness. What last thin pretense had remained that I was merely a guest lay discarded. He had evidently been through all this before. The horrors of Neuve-Chapelle had been convincing enough as he described them, yet they turned artificial with this knowledge of repetition. Their living reality became a matter of technique, of realism gained through rehearsal. It was like being earnestly persuaded an object was new by a seller who simultaneously and deliberately revealed it must be second-hand. An affront to all probability. I was not to believe in appearances, but why? Meanwhile, he had started weaving his web again, and once more I flew to meet it.